Under gray skies in late spring, a family of four packed their car for what was meant to be a short weekend camping trip. They left behind their quiet suburban street, telling friends and neighbors they planned to spend the night near the river, hike a trail or two, and be back by Sunday. The father, a steady man known for keeping to routines, loaded camping gear into the trunk while his wife double-checked supplies. Their two children, an energetic boy and his younger sister, were excited about the promise of roasted marshmallows and sleeping under canvas. To those who saw them leave, it looked like nothing more than an ordinary family getaway. But by the time Sunday came, they had disappeared into silence. When the family failed to return, relatives began calling. At first, there was no concern. Perhaps they had decided to extend the trip by another day. But by Monday morning, the absence grew darker. Workplaces confirmed neither parent had shown up. School reported the children missing. Calls went unanswered, phones went straight to voicemail, and the family's home remained locked, lights off, as though they had never come back. Police were alerted, and within hours, patrol cars were tracing the highways and Forest Service roads leading toward the river. The first major discovery came at a trailhead about 2 miles from the water. Their vehicle sat parked in an orderly fashion, doors locked, windows rolled up. Inside, investigators found camping gear, food supplies, and spare clothing, but no evidence the family had slept there. The tank was half full, the tires unmarked by damage, and the car appeared to have been left behind deliberately. To those on the ground, it was unsettling. The family's plan had always revolved around the river, yet there was no sign of them at the campsite. Search teams began to comb the surrounding woods. Helicopters circled overhead, dogs were brought in to trace scents, and volunteers stretched in lines across meadows and forests. The ground was damp from recent rains, making the job difficult. Tracks were found, but quickly lost in muddied soil. Then, near a bend of the river swollen with spring runoff, officers found evidence the family had stood on the banks. Impressions in the mud matched adult and child shoe sizes. A broken branch suggested someone had leaned heavily against it, and a scattering of food wrappers hinted they had stopped to rest. It was the first solid clue of where they had gone. The river that weekend was dangerous. Heavy snowmelt from the mountains had turned its normally calm waters into a churning brown torrent. Crossing it, even at the shallowest points, would have been a serious risk. Locals who saw the search unfold shook their heads, saying no one in their right mind would have tried it with children in tow. Yet the footprints told a story of approach, of hesitation, and perhaps of crossing. It was the most logical explanation the authorities could build at the time, that the family had tried to wade or raft across only to be swept downstream. But the more they searched, the less that theory seemed to hold. Divers went into the water again and again, scouring every channel and eddy, but found nothing. No bodies surfaced, no clothing snagged in the brush, no personal belongings washed ashore. Days passed, then weeks, with nothing but the endless sound of rushing water. If the river had taken them, it was unusual that it gave nothing back. Rumors began to move through the small town nearby. Some whispered the family had staged their disappearance, choosing the river as a perfect backdrop to vanish without a trace. Others believed something far darker had happened, that they had met someone along the way, someone who meant them harm. For the relatives waiting for news, these theories were unbearable. They clung instead to the simplest hope, that the family had simply been lost and would still be found alive. The pressure weighed heavily on searchers. Exhaustion and frustration became constant companions as each lead dissolved. Dogs led teams downriver, only to stop abruptly at dead ends. Helicopters hovered over the water with no result. The forest, vast and unforgiving, offered too many hiding places and too few answers. Investigators described the eerie stillness that hung over the search area, a silence broken only by the river, as though the landscape itself resisted revealing what had happened. By the third week, authorities had no choice but to reduce operations. Resources were pulled back, leaving only occasional patrols to revisit the area. The official statement offered the most probable explanation. The family had been swept away while attempting to cross the river. Yet without bodies, without a shred of physical proof, even the officials delivering those words admitted privately they could not be sure. For the town, the disappearance became more than a case. It became a wound. Families warned their children away from the water, and visitors hesitated before setting foot on the trails. At the riverbank where the footprints had been found, flowers and candles appeared, silent memorials for those who had not returned. The absence of evidence made it worse, leaving everyone with the feeling that the story was unfinished, a question waiting to be answered. 10 years later, the same river would hold its silence, hiding whatever truth it carried beneath the mud and current. And in that silence, the mystery of the vanished family would linger, gripping the community with a mix of fear, grief, and the unshakable sense that something was deeply wrong. Rescue teams arrived within hours of the family being declared missing, their vehicles lining the trailhead where the car had been discovered. What began as a search and rescue quickly grew into one of the largest coordinated efforts the county had ever seen. Volunteers poured in from surrounding towns, joining law enforcement officers, firefighters, and park rangers. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the canopy for signs of movement. Along the riverbanks, handlers released trained dogs, their noses pressed low against the ground in search of any human scent. Divers slipped beneath the muddy surface of the river, groping blindly through the dark current, yet every effort ended the same way, without results. Days stretched into a tense blur. The family's footprints near the riverbank gave rescuers their first lead, but no continuation of the tracks was found. The prints seemed to vanish at the water's edge, as if the river had swallowed the trail whole. Searchers worked tirelessly, combing every inch of shoreline and combing the nearby forest for signs of shelter, fire pits, or discarded belongings. But the woods yielded nothing except an oppressive quiet that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Strange details soon began to emerge. About a mile downstream, officers located a small clearing that looked as though it had been used as a campsite. At first, investigators believed it belonged to the missing family, but something about the scene felt wrong. The tent had been carefully packed away rather than left standing, and the fire pit was neatly cleared, almost staged. Food wrappers and cans were gathered in a tidy pile. To seasoned searchers, it looked too deliberate, too clean for a family supposedly caught off guard by disaster. The unsettling neatness of the campsite raised questions no one could answer. Even more unsettling was what searchers found 2 days later. A heavy cooler belonging to the family based on serial markings was discovered lodged against a sandbar. It had been locked shut, and inside, the contents were intact, food, water, and sealed snacks untouched. Investigators found themselves asking why the cooler had ended up in the river at all, and why it remained closed if the family had been in distress. Theories ranged from accidental loss during a river crossing to someone intentionally placing it there to confuse the investigation. Then came the matter of the missing shoes. Relatives confirmed that the children had been wearing brightly colored sneakers the day they left, and that the father always carried a pair of hiking boots. Yet during the search, investigators noted that only partial shoe prints were found, and some seemed to vanish entirely. No shoes were recovered, no scattered belongings along the water's edge, no explanation for why such identifiable items would disappear so completely. To many searchers, this was the detail that broke their confidence in the drowning theory. If the family had been swept away, why had the river given nothing back? The official line from authorities was cautious. They told reporters that the river was powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous. Bodies could be pulled under, trapped in submerged branches or rocks, hidden for months before reappearing miles away. Equipment, too, could vanish quickly beneath the surface. Yet behind closed doors, some officers admitted they were troubled by the lack of debris. They had seen drownings before, and though recovery sometimes took time, the water almost always revealed something. An article of clothing, a shoe, a body. Here, there was only silence. As the weeks dragged on, tensions grew. Families of the missing held vigils at the riverbank, their grief compounded by the absence of answers. Search teams rotated in and out, their morale fraying as each day ended with nothing. Some volunteers whispered of foul play, pointing to the locked cooler and the too-perfect campsite as signs of staging. Others clung to the belief that the family had drowned, insisting it was the only rational explanation. But in the absence of evidence, speculation thrived. By the third week, the rescue mission quietly shifted into a recovery effort. The The number of searchers dwindled, helicopters were recalled, and divers were no longer deployed daily. What had begun with urgency and hope was now defined by exhaustion and quiet despair. Theories hardened into two camps: those who believed the river had claimed the family, and those who believed someone or something else had intervened. Both carried weight, and both deepened the unease surrounding the case. As the official search wound down, the river remained as it always had, churning, restless, indifferent. It offered no answers, no trace of the 4 lives believed lost within it. For the town, the silence along its banks became unbearable, a reminder of how quickly certainty could dissolve into mystery. And as neighbors walked past the trailhead, they knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened out there, it had left behind a void that could not easily be filled. Detectives turned their attention away from the river and toward the lives of the people who had vanished. In cases where no physical evidence could be recovered, investigators often looked for motive, a reason the family might have disappeared by choice or by force. The first weeks of digging uncovered what seemed at first like ordinary struggles, but soon raised darker questions. Financial records showed the parents were behind on their mortgage, with credit card debt piling up faster than they could pay it down. Friends admitted the family had been under stress, and neighbors recalled hearing heated arguments through the walls at night. These details alone weren't enough to suggest a disappearance, but they created a shadow over the family's seemingly perfect image. The deeper detectives searched, the more contradictions they uncovered. Relatives painted the father as a reliable man, hard-working and devoted to his children, yet a co-worker described him as increasingly distant and short-tempered in the months before the trip. The mother, remembered by her friends as warm and attentive, had quietly confided in one that she felt trapped in a marriage that no longer made sense. Whispers of infidelity surfaced, with an unnamed acquaintance claiming she had been seen meeting a man in a nearby town, though no evidence beyond rumor could confirm it. The idea that tensions at home might have boiled over during the camping trip began to creep into the official conversation. One theory that took hold within the department was murder-suicide. Investigators considered the possibility that the father, pushed to a breaking point by debt and domestic turmoil, may have led his family into the woods with intentions far darker than a weekend retreat. In that narrative, the river served as the perfect backdrop for staging an accident, a way to erase evidence and frame tragedy as misfortune. But this idea was met with fierce resistance from those who knew him best. His siblings, who attended every search briefing, insisted he would never harm his children, that his life revolved around them. The contradiction left detectives with a theory they could not confirm and a family unwilling to accept it. Others believed the disappearance might have been orchestrated. Could the family have chosen to walk away, leaving behind debts and tension in exchange for a new life under new names? Law enforcement examined bank records, passport activity, and insurance policies, searching for signs of planning. But there were no large withdrawals, no unusual purchases, and no evidence of travel arrangements. Their accounts sat untouched after the day they vanished, frozen in time. Investigators noted that if the family had planned to disappear, they had done so with an impossible level of precision, leaving behind nothing for anyone to follow. The rumors in town grew darker as weeks became months. Some pointed to the mother's alleged affair, claiming she may have fled with her children, abandoning her husband. Others suggested she and her husband had conspired together, tired of the life they lived, vanishing into the vast wilderness to start over. With no evidence, the gossip fed itself, filling the silence left by the investigation. Each theory revealed more about the fears and suspicions of those left behind than it did about the truth of what had happened. Detectives struggled to maintain focus. Interviews often contradicted one another, family members describing stability while neighbors insisted on conflict, friends speaking of deep love while others hinted at betrayal. Every lead dissolved into conflicting accounts. The mother's phone records showed late-night calls to someone never identified, yet nothing about those conversations could be tied to the disappearance. The father's computer search history suggested he had been looking at camping routes and river conditions, but nothing sinister was found there either. Investigators were left staring at fragments that never aligned. By the end of the summer, the official case files swelled with statements, reports, and timelines. Yet the core remained unchanged. No bodies, no physical proof, no conclusive motive. Detectives admitted privately that they felt trapped in a maze of shadows, every path leading back to silence. For the families of the missing, the suggestions of murder-suicide or voluntary disappearance felt like betrayals, as though investigators were turning their grief into suspicion. Vigils continued at the riverbank, candles flickering against the night, while behind the scenes, detectives worked cases with far clearer evidence. The investigation remained technically open, but the momentum had drained away. Theories lingered in the air, some tragic, some sinister, some unthinkable, but none could be proven. The case hung suspended in that uneasy place between fact and speculation, where every answer seemed to collapse under its own weight. And as the first year without the family closed, what haunted the town most was not a single theory, but the absence of truth, a silence so complete it seemed to deepen with time. The river had always carried a reputation. Long before the family disappeared, locals told stories of its unpredictable currents, of men and women lost while fishing or rafting, of children swept under by sudden surges. There were legends, half remembered, of bodies never recovered, as though the river had the power to hold on to what it claimed. In small towns that bordered its banks, the water was treated with respect, but also with fear. Some residents whispered that the family had simply joined the list of names swallowed by the current, victims of the same cruel force that had claimed others before them. It was the simplest explanation, but even that felt incomplete when nothing surfaced, not even scraps of clothing or signs of a struggle. Survival experts were brought in to analyze the possibility. They studied maps of the watershed, noting hidden tributaries and deep undercurrents where a body could be trapped indefinitely. They explained that spring runoff transformed the river into something far more dangerous than it appeared, with hydraulic forces capable of pinning debris and people beneath the surface for months. If the family had tried to cross in the wrong place, they could have been caught in an invisible undertow and pulled into a submerged channel. To those who believed in this theory, the absence of evidence was not surprising. The river, they argued, was vast enough and violent enough to keep its secrets. Yet not everyone accepted that explanation. Seasoned search and rescue volunteers pointed out that even in the most extreme drownings, something usually surfaced. A shoe, a backpack, fragments of clothing, some trace almost always appeared within days or weeks. In this case, the river had returned almost nothing. The locked cooler, yes, but none of the essential items tied to human survival. No jackets, no sleeping bags, no shoes. It was as though the family had stepped into the current and vanished into air rather than water. This discrepancy fueled speculation that perhaps they had made it across after all. If they had survived the crossing, the question became what happened next. Some believed the family had reached the opposite bank and then disappeared deeper into the wilderness. The forest beyond the river stretched for miles, remote and unforgiving, a place where inexperienced hikers could quickly become disoriented. Survival experts outlined grim possibilities: hypothermia, dehydration, or injury from a fall. In that scenario, the family could have wandered aimlessly, perishing far from where anyone searched. Their remains might still be hidden under layers of forest growth, beyond the reach of rescue teams. But another interpretation lingered, one that unsettled investigators more than the idea of an accident. If the family had reached the far side of the river alive, then perhaps they had not been alone. Some townsfolk speculated that another person could have been waiting there, someone who offered help or lured them further into the woods. Without evidence, it was only a theory, but it spread quickly, carried by the silence of the case. The idea that the family's disappearance was not nature's doing, but the work of human hands, hung over the investigation like a shadow. Detectives revisited witness statements, asking whether anyone had seen strangers in the area that weekend. A few hikers reported spotting a lone figure near the water, though descriptions varied, and none could be verified. Others insisted they had seen nothing unusual. Still, the possibility of foul play grew harder to ignore as time passed. The neatness of the abandoned campsite, the locked cooler drifting downstream, the missing shoes, each detail fed the sense that this disappearance had been shaped by something more deliberate than a river accident. As the weeks wore on, the community found itself divided. Some clung firmly to the belief in the river's cruelty, finding comfort in the notion that the family had been claimed by nature rather than by violence. Others refused to accept that explanation, convinced the family had walked away from the water alive only to encounter something darker. The arguments spilled into town meetings, church gatherings, and late-night conversations, with every side certain they were right. In the end, both theories shared one haunting truth. There was no closure. Whether the river had taken them or whether they had vanished beyond it, the result was the same: silence, absence, and a trail that ended in questions. Searchers stood at the riverbank staring at the unyielding current and wondered which was worse, that the family had drowned unseen or that they had lived long enough to disappear into something no one had yet discovered. As the seasons shifted and the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, the urgency that once surrounded the case had begun to fade. The search parties were long gone, replaced instead by quiet gatherings where candles were lit and prayers were whispered. News crews returned briefly to film updates, showing the same trailhead, the same stretch of river, and the same unanswered questions. Each broadcast carried the same refrain: no progress, no bodies, no closure. What had once been a daily story of shock had hardened into a cold case, the details recited less like breaking news and more like a local legend. The family's relatives clung desperately to hope in the beginning. They organized fundraisers, created flyers, and kept the missing family's faces in the public eye. For months they called investigators weekly, asking if anything new had been discovered, but the answer was always the same: nothing. As the years passed, grief began to change them. Some grew weary of carrying the burden of uncertainty and quietly moved away, leaving behind the town that reminded them of everything they had lost. Others stayed, but the weight of unanswered questions wore them down. They stopped speaking about the details and instead referred to the disappearance with vague phrases as if naming it outright might reopen the wound. The trailhead where the car had been found became a place people avoided. In the early years, some curious visitors went there, hoping to feel closer to the mystery, but eventually the area grew desolate. Locals said the silence near the river felt heavier than anywhere else, as though it carried the memory of what had been lost. Families planning camping trips chose different routes, steering clear of the water altogether. For the children who grew up hearing about the vanished family, the story became part of the landscape itself, a cautionary tale whispered to keep them away from the riverbanks. Despite the silence, there were those who refused to let the mystery fade. Once a year, on the anniversary, relatives and supporters returned to the trailhead. They lit candles, read the names aloud, and left flowers at the spot where the footprints had last been seen. But even these vigils began to shrink in size. What had started as a community-wide event became, over time, a small cluster of family members standing in the dark, staring into the trees. The reporters stopped showing up, the news coverage dwindled, and the case slipped further from the public eye. Detectives who had once pored over the evidence moved on to other cases. Files grew dusty on office shelves, and younger officers entering the department knew the story only through paperwork, not through lived experience. The case was technically open, but everyone understood that it was frozen. Without new evidence, there was nothing more to be done. Over the years, the file became little more than a relic, a reminder of an investigation that had ended in silence. In town, the story took on the qualities of folklore. Parents told their children about the family who went to the river and never returned, warning them not to wander too close. Teenagers dared each other to visit the trailhead at night, speaking of ghosts and curses as if the family's absence had become supernatural. But underneath the stories and rumors was the harsh truth. 4 people had disappeared in plain sight, and no one had been able to explain how. That truth, stripped of embellishment, was more unsettling than any legend. For the family members left behind, life moved forward in fractured ways. Birthdays passed without celebration, holidays carried empty chairs, and photographs remained frozen in time. Some relatives admitted they preferred to think of the family as gone, claimed by the river, because the alternative, that they had suffered some darker fate, was unbearable. Others lived with the torment of imagining them still alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Both versions carried pain, and neither brought peace. As a decade slowly approached, the disappearance no longer felt like a current tragedy, but a permanent scar in the community's history. The names of the missing were still known, but spoken less often, as though the town had learned to coexist with the silence rather than challenge it. And yet, for those who stood at the trailhead, staring into the restless river, one thought lingered: mysteries do not vanish, they only wait. The family had crossed the river and never returned, and until the land or the water gave up its secrets, the story would remain suspended, part grief, part legend, and entirely unresolved. 10 years had passed since the family vanished, and in that time the case had settled into the silence of a cold file, a story mentioned only in whispers or on the anniversaries when the relatives returned to light candles by the trailhead. Most people in town had learned to live with the uncertainty, burying the unease beneath the routines of daily life. But in the spring of the 10th year, the river finally stirred again, not with bodies or confessions, but with something far more unsettling. A hiker, unfamiliar with the full weight of the legend, was trekking along the river's edge when he noticed a glint of metal in the mud. At first, he thought it was debris from some long-forgotten campsite, but when he bent down and pulled it free, he realized it was a rusted license plate. The numbers were still visible, and though he didn't know it at the time, they matched the missing family's vehicle. The discovery made little sense. The car had been recovered a decade earlier at the trailhead, its plates intact, its condition stable. Yet, here was another plate, weathered by years of exposure and buried beneath layers of silt. When the hiker turned the plate over in his hands, mud clinging to the corroded edges, he felt a chill he couldn't explain. He reported the find immediately, and within days, investigators were back at the river for the first time in years, their presence stirring old wounds in the community. When forensic teams arrived, they expanded the search around the area where the plate had been uncovered. Metal detectors swept through the soil, shovels cut into the earth, and dogs trained in scent detection combed the banks. Slowly, more items began to surface. A child's shoe, small and faded, its fabric stiff with age, emerged from the mud just a few yards away. The tread was worn, but enough detail remained for relatives to identify it as belonging to the youngest child. Investigators handled it with quiet reverence, the weight of what it represented pressing heavily on everyone who watched. Nearby, buried deeper in the soil, searchers recovered a bent wristwatch, its glass cracked, its band twisted and broken. Though corroded, it still bore the engraving on the back, initials that matched the father's. And then came the discovery of fabric strips, torn and weathered, fragments that appeared to be from clothing. Forensic testing later confirmed that the material's age matched the timeline of the disappearance, and one piece carried faint traces of stitching that matched the daughter's jacket. These were not random objects lost by hikers or washed down from campsites. They belonged to the family. The findings raised questions no one could easily answer. How had these items ended up here, miles from the trailhead where the car was found? Why had they remained hidden for so long, only to emerge now? Some speculated that the river had shifted, loosening what it had held beneath its banks. Others suggested the items had been deliberately placed or buried, concealed in a spot no one would think to search. Theories reignited almost immediately, old suspicions roaring back into the spotlight. The town, long resigned to silence, suddenly found itself gripped by the mystery again. For the relatives of the missing, the discoveries were both heartbreaking and validating. The shoe and the watch proved the family had made it beyond the riverbank, contradicting the theory that they had drowned immediately upon attempting to cross. But it also opened doors to darker possibilities, that they had survived the crossing, only to face something worse on the other side. Detectives who had retired from the case were called back to review the new evidence. They pored over maps and reports, tracing the distance between the car, the riverbank, and the site of the discovery. Nothing aligned neatly. If the family had tried to vanish voluntarily, why would personal belongings resurface here, scattered and buried? If foul play had occurred, who had the means and opportunity to move and conceal these objects? And if the river itself had carried them here, why had it held them in silence for an entire decade before finally letting them go? The recovered artifacts were sent to labs, examined under microscopes, and scanned for DNA. Soil samples clinging to the items indicated they had been disturbed more recently than their age suggested, hinting they may have been buried or uncovered within the past few years, rather than left untouched for 10. This detail unsettled investigators deeply, for it implied that someone, or something, had moved them long after the family had disappeared. For the community, the unearthed objects shattered the uneasy peace that had settled over the years. What had once been a cold legend was suddenly alive again, filled with fresh possibilities and renewed grief. Families gathered once more at the river, staring at the spot where the discoveries had been made, whispering questions into the restless current. The river had kept its secrets for a decade, and now, it seemed, it had decided to release them one piece at a time. As investigators boxed up the rusted license plate, the child's shoe, the twisted watch, and the strips of fabric, one fact became impossible to ignore. These were not just relics of a lost family. They were fragments of a story that had never truly ended. And with their reappearance, the haunting question returned in full force. Had the river claimed the family, or had they crossed it and met a fate far darker than anyone had dared to believe? When the items arrived at the state forensic lab, they were treated with the gravity of evidence long denied to investigators. Technicians worked slowly, cataloging every fragment as though they might collapse under too much handling. The rusted license plate was photographed, its corroded edges sealed in protective casing. The child's shoe was swabbed for DNA, the bent wristwatch dusted for trace elements, and the fabric strips placed under microscopes to examine their weave and wear. Each item carried a story locked inside it, and for the first time in 10 years, there was hope that the silence of the case might finally break. The first revelation came from the shoe. Despite years in the soil, enough material remained intact for DNA testing, and the results matched the missing family's youngest child without question. The finding confirmed beyond speculation that the family had survived long enough to cross the river, shattering the long-standing theory that they had drowned upon attempting the crossing. It was proof they had gone further, that their journey had continued past the point investigators had stopped searching. But instead of offering relief, the confirmation raised even darker questions. If they had survived the river, why had they vanished so completely afterward? Attention turned next to the soil clinging to the items. Analysts compared it against samples collected from the area during the initial investigation. What they found was unsettling. The sediment pattern suggested the items had not been buried for 10 years, but much less, likely within the last 2 to 4 years. That meant the objects had either been unearthed and reburied by natural forces, or worse, deliberately placed there long after the family had disappeared. To investigators, this detail shifted the entire case. If someone had hidden the belongings, it suggested an active effort to obscure the truth, raising the possibility of human involvement in what had once been considered a tragic accident. The watch provided another disturbing detail. Forensic metallurgists examined the bent casing and determined the damage was consistent with blunt force impact, not gradual weathering. It had not simply corroded over time, it had been struck or crushed before ending up in the mud. The engraving on its back, still faintly visible, made identification certain. It belonged to the father. To the relatives waiting anxiously for updates, the discovery of the watch was devastating. It felt less like an object of closure and more like a fragment of violence, a suggestion that he had not simply wandered into the wilderness, but encountered something brutal. The fabric strips were equally troubling. Under magnification, some bore signs of tearing, but others appeared cut, the fibers severed cleanly rather than frayed by natural wear. One swatch carried faint traces of what could be biological material, though time and exposure had degraded it beyond clear testing. Still, the possibility was enough to reignite speculation. Investigators debated whether these cuts were from rescue tools, accidental snags, or deliberate actions meant to conceal evidence. The uncertainty only deepened the shadows already surrounding the case. Publicly, officials were cautious, releasing only that the items belonged to the missing family and were being tested further. Privately, detectives admitted to each other that the evidence didn't align with the narrative they had clung to for a decade. The river had been a convenient explanation, a natural force that required no malice to explain the disappearance, but these objects suggested something else. They weren't scattered randomly by water or weather. They were clustered, concealed, and altered. That pattern spoke less of accident and more of intent. The town received the news with a mix of dread and vindication. Those who had always suspected foul play saw the findings as confirmation. Others resisted, unwilling to let go of the simpler drowning theory that had allowed them to close the door on the tragedy years earlier. Families whispered about who could have been involved, reviving old suspicions about strangers in the area or unsettled conflicts in the family's past. But even among the skeptics, the question gnawed at them all. If the family had indeed reached the far bank alive, what had become of them afterward, and who had gone to such lengths to erase the trail? For the relatives of the missing, the discoveries reopened wounds that had begun to scar over. The DNA confirmation of the child's shoe was both a gift and a curse. It gave them undeniable proof of where the family had been, but no comfort about where they had gone. The thought that someone might have hidden these belongings years after the disappearance was almost unbearable, a suggestion that the truth had been close all along, only buried deeper than anyone thought to look. As the forensic teams sealed their findings into evidence lockers, detectives faced the same question that had haunted them since the very beginning. Not just how the family vanished, but why. And this time, the river was no longer the sole suspect. The objects pulled from the mud spoke of survival, of movement, of interference. They pointed toward a truth that someone, somewhere, might have worked hard to conceal. The recovery of the family's belongings jolted the investigation back to life, forcing detectives to confront names that had once lingered on their suspect lists before fading into the background. For a decade, the case had been dormant, little more than a memory preserved in dusty files, but now the objects found in the mud suggested intent, concealment, and possibly violence. With fresh evidence on the table, investigators began revisiting those whose names had been whispered in the early days of the disappearance. The first was a neighbor who lived only a few streets away from the family before they vanished. His reputation was well known in town, a man with a violent temper and a history of confrontations. Police records showed calls for domestic disturbances at his residence, and there were reports of bitter arguments with the missing father over property lines and noise complaints. At the time, his alibi had been shaky, but with no physical evidence linking him to the disappearance, he had eventually been dismissed. Now, with the possibility that the belongings had been moved or planted years after the fact, detectives wondered whether his proximity and history of aggression might deserve a second look. Next came a co-worker of the father, a man entangled with him in a financial dispute. Investigators uncovered old documents pointing to disagreements over money borrowed and never repaid, arguments that had grown heated in the weeks before the camping trip. Rumors circulated that the co-worker had threatened to settle things once and for all, though nothing had been formally recorded. In the original investigation, this lead had fizzled out when the co-worker produced time cards showing he had been at work during the critical weekend. But modern forensic tools gave detectives the ability to scrutinize those records more carefully, raising doubts about whether they had been as airtight as once believed. Perhaps the most enduring suspicion, however, centered around a drifter who had been spotted near the river that same weekend. Hikers had reported seeing him moving along the trails, carrying a heavy pack and keeping to himself. Law enforcement had interviewed him at the time, finding nothing more than circumstantial presence, and eventually let him go. But his whereabouts afterward became difficult to trace, and some locals insisted he had vanished from the area just as suddenly as the family. The resurfaced evidence reignited interest in his movements, and detectives worked to retrace his trail through old records and scattered witness accounts, hoping to determine if his presence near the river was more than coincidence. Forensic testing of the recovered items provided some answers, but not nearly enough. The soil samples confirmed disturbance within the last few years, but no fingerprints or usable DNA, beyond the child's confirmation, were found. The bent wristwatch yielded partial prints, degraded beyond comparison, Fibers on the fabric matched the family's belongings, but nothing foreign was discovered. If someone had indeed moved or hidden the items, they had done so carefully, leaving little trace behind. This lack of evidence became both frustrating and chilling, as it suggested an intentional act executed with precision. As the case reopened, the community fractured under the weight of suspicion. Families and neighbors who had lived side by side for years now eyed one another warily, each convinced of a different truth. Some were certain the violent neighbor was responsible, pointing to his history of anger and his proximity to the family. Others believed the financial disputes were the key, insisting the co-worker had a stronger motive than anyone else. Still others clung to the story of the drifter, the stranger who had passed through town and could have easily left destruction behind before moving on. The debates grew heated, spilling into town meetings, church gatherings, and even online forums where theories were dissected endlessly. For relatives of the missing, the tension was unbearable. They watched as the memory of their loved ones was overshadowed by accusations and speculation, yet they too could not stop themselves from wondering who among the suspects might have carried the truth. Every phone call from detectives reignited hope, only for the updates to circle back into the same refrain. There were leads, but no certainty. Detectives admitted that while modern testing had ruled out a few names, those with solid alibis verified by newly accessed data, the core suspects remained unresolved. Each had motive, each had opportunity, and each left just enough of a shadow to remain plausible. The investigation, though revitalized, seemed once again to be running in circles. The items in the mud had broken the silence, but they had not provided a path forward. For the townsfolk, the case once again became an obsession, a rift that divided them into camps of belief. Neighbors turned cold, old friendships soured, and suspicion seeped into everyday conversations. The haunting truth was that a decade later, the mystery felt no closer to resolution. Instead, the discovery had only deepened the divides, ensuring that the family's absence would remain not just a wound, but a conflict that pitted community against community, truth against theory. The investigation, reignited by the belongings pulled from the mud, took a grim turn when search teams widened their excavation along the riverbank. What began as a careful recovery of objects became something darker as shovels struck soil not untouched but disturbed. Beneath a thin layer of earth, investigators uncovered fragments of bone. At first, there was hesitation. Skeletal remains along rivers were not uncommon, sometimes belonging to animals carried downstream. But as more of the fragments surfaced, the shape of a human jaw and the curve of a rib left no doubt. The site was immediately sealed off, and forensic specialists were called in. Excavation continued slowly, every layer documented with precision. The remains were shallowly buried, no more than a few feet beneath the surface, as though someone had concealed them in haste rather than care. Partial skeletons emerged, incomplete yet undeniably human. Pieces of clothing clung to the bones, weathered but still identifiable. A shirt fragment matched what relatives remembered the father wearing the day they left, while a small scrap of fabric aligned with the youngest child's clothing. The scene was heavy with silence, as officers realized they were no longer chasing theories, but standing in the presence of the missing. The discovery was devastating. Forensics later confirmed that the bones belonged to the father and the youngest child. DNA testing removed all doubt, matching them conclusively to the family. After a decade of uncertainty, there was finally proof of what many had feared, but never voiced aloud. The family had not vanished into thin air, nor had the river alone swallowed them. They had been placed here, intentionally hidden, and left to decay under the soil. Cause of death, however, remained elusive. The skeletons bore fractures, some consistent with blunt force trauma, others potentially the result of post-mortem damage caused by shifting earth. Forensic anthropologists hesitated to draw conclusions, but admitted the pattern was troubling. The breaks did not align with those typically seen in drowning accidents. Instead, they suggested impact, perhaps a fall, perhaps violence inflicted before burial. The ambiguity left investigators torn between explanations, but the shadow of foul play loomed larger than ever. The revelation spread through the community like a shockwave. For 10 years, residents had lived with the possibility that the river had claimed the family, a cruel accident that left no trace. Now that fragile comfort was shattered. Someone had buried them. Someone had known exactly where they lay while vigils were held and theories raged. The idea that human hands had shaped the family's fate brought a new horror, one far more terrifying than the river's indifference. Relatives of the missing were thrust back into grief they had barely learned to carry. The father's siblings wept openly when told his remains had been found, struggling to reconcile the man they had known with the way his life had ended. The child's discovery was almost unbearable, the shoe found earlier now paired with the heartbreaking confirmation that its owner had been buried in the same soil. For the mother and eldest child, still unaccounted for, hope flickered briefly, only to twist into dread. Were they buried elsewhere? Or had their remains been scattered where they would never be found? Detectives, too, felt the weight of the discovery. What had begun as a disappearance explained by natural forces was now undeniably a crime scene. Theories of orchestrated vanishing or murder-suicide faltered under the evidence. Two members of the family had not walked away. They had been silenced and deliberately hidden. The search for answers shifted focus again, narrowing from speculation to the hunt for whoever had been responsible. Yet the evidence, even as it deepened the horror, remained incomplete. The burial site contained no tools, no foreign DNA, no footprints preserved in the soil. Whoever had done this had left behind nothing except the remains themselves. The precision of the concealment suggested either luck or experience, a knowledge of the land and the way time and erosion would eventually cloak the grave. It was a clue, but one as haunting as it was unhelpful. As the remains were carried out in bags, the weight of what lay beneath the riverbank settled over everyone who watched. After years of silence, the land had spoken. But it had spoken in fragments, 2 bodies instead of 4, fractures instead of clarity, concealment instead of truth. The horror of the unearthed grave was not only in what it revealed, but in what it withheld. The unearthed grave gave investigators their first undeniable confirmation in a decade. Yet even as forensic teams packed away the remains of the father and the youngest child, the silence around the rest of the family pressed harder. 2 bodies had been found, but 2 were still missing. The mother and the eldest child, gone without a trace. Theories multiplied, but none could be proven. Had they escaped the violence that claimed their family and fled into the wilderness? Had they been taken elsewhere, hidden in a second grave waiting to be uncovered? Or were their bones lying undiscovered in the same soil, scattered too far for searchers to find? Each possibility carried its own torment, and none offered peace. Detectives officially reopened the case, treating the new evidence as proof that foul play had been involved all along. Old suspects were questioned again, alibis re-examined, records pulled from storage. Forensic analysts pored over the fractures in the bones, debating whether they were caused by blunt instruments or the natural collapse of earth over time. Soil analysis confirmed the remains had been in the ground for nearly the full decade, but the burial was shallow, rushed, and strangely incomplete. It was as though whoever had hidden them had not expected the grave to be discovered, yet also had not taken the time to bury all 4 together. That choice, or mistake, became one of the case's most haunting details. The mother's absence cast an especially heavy shadow. Some investigators wondered if she'd been complicit, that perhaps the tension in her marriage or the rumors of an affair had driven her to orchestrate the disappearance, only for something to go terribly wrong. Others countered that she may have been a victim, taken with her eldest child to a second location by the same person who buried the others. The lack of evidence meant both scenarios carried weight, though neither could be substantiated. Each time detectives tried to form a coherent picture, contradictions splintered their theories back into uncertainty. For the community, the discoveries deepened old divisions. Those who had clung to the idea of a drowning accident were now forced to accept that the family's fate had been shaped by human hands. But what kind of hands remained hotly debated. Some accused the violent neighbor again, pointing to his knowledge of the land and his history of rage. Others argued that the co-workers' financial disputes remained the most plausible motive. A smaller group still blamed the mysterious drifter seen near the river that weekend, convinced his disappearance from the area was no coincidence. Every conversation in town seemed to reopen the wound, but none could close it. Relatives of the missing endured the cruelest burden. They buried 2 family members with the grim comfort of certainty, while 2 others remained suspended in absence. Grave sites were prepared, headstones engraved, but each ceremony was hollow, as though the unanswered questions hovered over the service itself. For the mother's siblings, the uncertainty was unbearable. They refused to believe she had abandoned her family, yet they had no explanation for why her body had not been found. For the eldest child's friends, the thought that she might still be alive somewhere haunted their imaginations, though experience told them otherwise. The reopened case attracted new attention, drawing journalists back to the trailhead and the banks of the river. Documentaries and podcasts retold the story, their tones speculative, filling in the silence with dramatic theories. But for the detectives still assigned to the file, the noise of public attention only highlighted the emptiness of the evidence. They had bones, but no murder weapon. They had a grave, but no witnesses. They had questions, but no truth. And without those, the case could move no closer to resolution than it had a decade earlier. The river itself seemed to mock the search for answers. Its currents still rushed with the same indifference, its banks still marked by silence. Visitors described an uneasy feeling when standing there, as though the land carried memory in its soil. For locals, it became a place not of recreation, but of avoidance, a landscape haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of what it had hidden. Parents warned their children to stay away, and travelers passing through often heard the story without ever realizing how much it still lingered for those who lived nearby. 10 years had turned a disappearance into legend, and the discoveries had shifted it again into something darker, a crime without clarity, a mystery without end. The truth seemed always just beyond reach. Tangled between survival and violence, escape and concealment, and so the story of the family who crossed the river hardened into something permanent, etched not only in case files, but in the community's memory. 2 bodies had been pulled from the ground, 2 were still missing, and the silence of the forest seemed to insist that no more would ever be given. What remained was a crossing that had stolen 4 lives and returned only bones and questions, a mystery that refused to rest.